live at this point?
We're live
Justin.
now.
Yep. We're
Okay,
on.
well, welcome everybody. Members of the public, we have a long list of witnesses this morning, and we're pretty targeted on the issue of accessory dwelling units. We do have Tom Cavett coming in for about 20 minutes at the end of the day to talk to us about the capital investment program and his involvement with that. So let's get started. My recollection, and I forgive me in advance, I'm working off my iPhone because my computer's not working. So I have a very limited screen options, but my recollection is we're starting off with Ellen to give us the legislative history of ADUs, when they, over time, statutorily, I actually was involved in the very first ADU bill back in the 1900s somewhere. And that's when I first met Karen Horn. We did battle over this. We were both relatively new to the lobbying. I was lobbying for the elderly, and she was lobbying for the League of Cities and Towns. And I hope her position on this issue has evolved over time. So let's hear from Ellen as to the legislative history of ADUs.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, it occurred to me that you probably could actually do part of this presentation because I know that you worked on the original version. So
yeah, but my memory is not good.
Okay. Well, so I did go back and I went back through the statutes to 1975, which is a little more difficult than it sounds. And I didn't find anything before it's 1992, the bill you were talking about. So I didn't find anything specific to accessory dwelling units or accessory apartment units, as they were sometimes called. I didn't find anything specific to them before the 1992 bill. It doesn't mean that there wasn't anything, but searching the statutes once you get back that far is a little time consuming. So I did find the 1992 bill, and it has a pretty similar structure, at least to the language that you've been working on. And so to take a step back, 2 years ago, this committee did work on an amendment to the accessory dwelling unit law. This phrase accessory dwelling unit primarily appears in the statutes regarding municipal zoning and planning. And so it's used in a couple other small sections, but just really in referencing how it's used in the zoning regulations. So if Scott, can I share my screen? So I'm going to put the 1992 bill up on the screen just because it is extremely short, and it's got a similar structure to what you are familiar with, but I think putting it up on the screen will make it easy to see the changes that you made. So it's starting on this we're on the right side of this page here. So this bill in 1992, the first section amended the goal section of chapter 117 of title 24. That is the section that all the zoning laws are in. And so it added accessory apartments into the goal section as something to be considered to provide affordable housing. It then also added reference to accessory apartments into the requirements for the town plan. So it added it here to section 4382A10, and it added it to the section related to the requirement that the town plan have a housing element. So town plans have to have a housing element describing what type of housing is needed for the town. Specifically, it needs to address low and moderate income housing. So it added the program may include provision for conditionally permitted accessory apartments within or attached to a single family residence, which provide affordable housing in close proximity to cost-effective care and supervision for relatives or disabled or elderly person. So, so that hits all the elements that's going to be in the actual next section, but yeah, so it required that this be part of the town plan and their town planning process. So then section 3 of this bill in 1992 added the primary language regarding accessory units. So it was added to section 4406, and it says, except as provided in 4407, no zoning regulation shall have the effect of excluding for review as a conditional use one dwelling unit constructed within or attached to a primary single-family residence located in a district in which single-family residents are permitted or conditional use. So this is the first difference from where the law is today. This said that towns couldn't prohibit accessory dwelling units from being they couldn't fully prohibit them, but they could require that they get a conditional use permit. So
well, and does that, I remember back then and from my time on zoning boards and DRBs, that essentially means you have a right to get in the door, but towns could still put a lot of bells and whistles of conditions on it that could limit the development of these ADUs, but at least you'd be able to get in and put an application and make your case. Is that pretty much
yes.
a layperson's definition of conditional use?
Yeah, and I would also add, I think of it as like the mid-tier permit. Site plan review only only lets the town look at a couple aspects as opposed to a full permitted review. But conditional use does have a list of requirements the town is going to look at. And you may recall from past discussions, this is where the character of the area usually comes into the discussion.
Mm-hmm.
So it's definitely one of the permit reviews that has different elements that an applicant needs to show. So then the other restrictions on this are these accessory units shall satisfy the following requirements. Occupancy is restricted to not more than 2 persons, one of whom is related by blood or marriage to the owner of the single-family residence, is disabled as defined in the statute, or is at least 55 years of age. So this is interesting because I didn't realize this was in here. So this is basically saying who is allowed to live in an accessory unit. Not more than 2 people, they either have to be related by blood or marriage, they had to be disabled, or over 55. This is not in the current law. Next, floor space shall not exceed 30% of the floor space of the existing living area of the single family residence, or 400 square feet, whichever is greater. And then the primary single residence is occupied by the owner. And so these last 2 requirements, these are somewhat similar to where we are today, but obviously there has been a change, especially in your last amendment of this law 2 years ago. So the law as it currently is does say an accessory dwelling unit shouldn't exceed 30% of the floor space or 900 square feet, whichever is greater. And then the last part about the owner occupied aspect is another thing that you changed. So you did change the wording of the law so that this law here was requiring that the larger of the house be owner occupied, and the way it is now definitely allows for the flexibility of the owner can live in either the smaller or the larger unit. And also I think we just said that they need to live on the site.
We only just changed that,
right.
The larger, smaller piece.
Yep.
But I assume you'll get on to the other changes, but this section here is a floor for towns. The towns could at that point go much broader and more liberal in their allowance of accessory dwellings. In other words, they could have even before this law or after this law, it wasn't required that the person be 55 years or older if a town wanted to say anybody could live in an accessory dwelling unit. But towns that may be resistant to having any ADUs would at least have to provide for this. Do I have that correct?
Yes, you are correct. And that's the last section of this bill, which references that any existing accessory dwelling units that a town has already allowed are not impacted by this bill. And so I do think that suggests that some towns were already doing permitting or allowing accessory units that had slightly different requirements on them. So yes, I agree. I think the towns were allowed to do this, but this was setting the floor.
Can I just make sure I understand that fully in the context of owner occupied? So this is saying that you have to allow an ADU if there's no owner occupation on either side of the dwelling. But a town could decide to say that it doesn't have to be owner occupied. They can depart in that direction.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, so, and to take a step back, in this original bill in 1992, the owner had to live in the big house.
Mm-hmm.
And that has since changed. But
Yeah.
yes, towns are allowed to be more permissive in how they regulate this.
So may I just ask, when does it stop being an ADU, and when does it just become an apartment building if the owner doesn't live in it? Because it's interesting. I think a lot of our expectation with an ADU is that it is owner occupied, that one or the other living space is owner occupied. So, I mean, at some point it just morphs into another rental property if an owner isn't present. I mean, it's interesting when you say that, Ellen. It does occur to me that my just grounded assumption is that an ADU is a term that we think of as owner occupied,
So,
one or the other. But if it's just two spaces in a building, that's just an apartment building.
So I'm going to stop sharing. So the change that you made in 2020. So
Right.
Yeah, we did work on this in 2020. So
Right,
the language
did.
that's in the statute currently says an owner occupied lot.
Right.
And so you sort of made it a little more ambiguous about where the owner needs to be living.
So the owner could live in the carriage house on the top floor, and the main house could have two apartment spaces.
I think that was your intent. Yes.
I think that was our example.
So I think a lot of communities have just asked what happens if they sell this, and maybe you all talked about this as a committee before. Then does it just become two rental units? I mean, or is that kind of is that part of our discussion, the ambiguity of people feeling worried about getting themselves engaged in a lot of renovation or construction and then worried what will happen if they do move out?
I think that, well, I don't know how Ellen would answer that. I think we'll hear from other witnesses, but my recollection of the beauty of ADUs is they add on a complement to a zoning law that may say single family residence only. So we're trying to say, okay, and there were many towns that had areas that said you could only build single family homes. And so now with this law back in 1992, at least as a conditional use, you could go in and say, I want to build a separate living unit within my home or on the same lot or attached to my home. And you would have a right to go in and get a permit for that. And if the zoning law of that town didn't allow for that, then they would be in non-compliance with the law. So I think we need to look at it that way. I mean, it you know, if duplexes are allowed in a zone, there may be no reason for this law. But I'm sure this will become a little clearer as we hear from all these witnesses. So,
Right, but it's a good flag, I think, for us to think, it does once it's been developed in this capacity, do we, to go to Keisha's point, is there a covenant that goes forward with it saying the owner has to live in one of those, let's say 2 or 3 units going forward after it's been sold? What's the ongoing requirement that we still have an owner who's anchored on that property, which is, I think, what neighbors would be concerned about, because I think that's one of the glories of the ADU law, is that it still has a person who is anchored financially and emotionally in a community, in a neighborhood. So I think that's my flag, is going forward, what do we require? So that just doesn't have to chat about now, but I mean, I just want to flag that.
okay. So Ellen, was there only one legislative change? I thought there was some expansion after 1992 and before 2020, or maybe I'm just thinking of certain municipalities like Burlington changing their ordinances, but.
So in 2004, all of Chapter 117 was over. There was an overhaul and it was rewritten. And so there were a couple of small changes that were made then. And that was the change that changed from conditional use to permitted use. I think that's the year that it went from, because sometime between 1992 and 2004, the requirement for a conditional use permit was lost. So that was one change. And then in 2013, there was a large bill that was all about flood mitigation and flood hazard areas in municipal zoning. And so that added a small caveat that's part of the current bill, that zoning can't prohibit accessory dwelling units. However, if they're located in a flood hazard area, the town can address that in the bylaws and can potentially condition permits on accessory dwelling units if they're in the floodway. And then that brings us up to your 2020 bill.
Can you, before you get to the 2020 bill, I remember that going from conditional use to permitted use, considering that a fairly significant change, because as this was sort of cutting edge back in 1992, proponents of the bill had to agree to the conditional use for the towns to retain some authority by putting a bunch of conditions that which could potentially dilute what the bill was trying to achieve. And when the conditional use went away and it became a permitted use, I mean, that doesn't change setback requirements and things like that, but it does as Ellen says, maybe they couldn't use character of the area as a reason to deny a use. But I don't know if you could talk a little bit about the difference between permitted use and conditional use, and what powers it gives the town, and how it could restrict the development, how this expanded the ability to use ADUs when they went to permitted uses.
Right. So it didn't require that the elements of the conditional use permit be met by a homeowner. You're right, though. I skipped over. So a little in that change, there was a couple of other things added to the statute I think, potentially build in some of these requirements. So the language was changed to specifically say that it was an efficiency or one-bedroom apartment that is clearly subordinate to the single-family dwelling and has facilities for independent living, including sleeping, food preparation, and sanitation, provided that it has sufficient wastewater capacity, doesn't exceed the 30% size, and meets the applicable setbacks, coverage, and parking requirements specified in the bylaws.
Right.
But it did also add, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place here. It did also say that conditional use could be required if there was an accessory structure built. So if they were building a structure on the property to accommodate this unit, or they were increasing the height or the floor area of the existing house, or increasing the dimensions of parking. So you're right, there was a bit of a compromise there where it wasn't just a complete blanket allowance for these things. There were some additional provisions that lined up with existing zoning requirements that an owner would need to remain under or directly apply to their unit in order to be allowed to do this.
Okay, let's move on to the next change.
So then that brings us up to your 2020 language, which we worked on in S237 2 years ago. So let's see. So you added language, as I mentioned before, changed it from owner occupied dwelling to owner occupied lot. You added language that says the bylaw may require a single family dwelling with an accessory dwelling unit to be subject to the same review, dimensional, or other controls as required for a single family dwelling without an ADU. You also struck the requirement that it be either an efficiency apartment or a one bedroom, so it can have any configuration of rooms as the owner would like. And then you again raised the size from 30% or 900 square feet, whichever is larger. And you struck the requirement that they needed to meet applicable setback, coverage, and parking requirements. And you struck the requirement that a conditional use permit could be required for expansion, including the new building, raising the height or the floor area, or increasing parking. So you struck that language.
Okay. So one of the things for our omnibus bill is how we can promote the development of ADUs as a cost-effective tool to expand the amount of housing and, the other ancillary benefits of caregiving and things like that. But it may not require any changes to existing law. It just may require money or resources or technical assistance at this point. And I'm sure we're going to want to look at those things. But if there are other changes to our law that could help facilitate the development of these things, that's what we may hear from some of our witnesses this morning. And just also this morning, learning about the importance of ADUs on a number of fronts. It seems that they're getting a lot of national publicity, not as a cure-all, but certainly as a way to promote more affordable, less expensive development and building things from scratch. And in my mind, we're giving a lot of money out there to help redevelop developing housing. And even in the VHIP program, we talked about grants going out to help develop substandard housing, but also to develop ADUs. And you'll probably recall that the housing department came in and said they haven't done much in the way of ADUs, but they want to start doing more. So we may need to tweak that statute to make sure that if we want to develop more ADUs, that we direct some of that money towards that. In my dreams, one of the things that I could see if we really do want to use ADUs as a tool to help solve the housing problem we have, we should make it really easy for the average homeowner to have this happen. So there should be some sort of resources and support that they don't fret about having to get permits or where to find builders or how to design, just the things we do in a lot of other things in housing, direct them specifically towards ADUs. So that's where I'm coming from. Ellen, do you have anything more? I thank you very much for that history. And I know you have to be elsewhere, but as long as you can stay with us, that would be great.
I do have to go. Senator Clarkson, you're muted if you're trying to ask a question.
Yeah, someone's going to have to help me with that, because the only
I know
thing
I will, but I myself have to be unmuted, of course, to be helpful to you. Ellen, may I just ask, I can't remember, we didn't just blow open the size an ADU could be. I thought we keep the 900 square feet? Did we ended up with a 30% or 900 square feet? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. I from what you were saying, I thought, God, did we just blow that open? We didn't.
No, you took away the municipality's regulation,
right,
sort of, requiring that they meet the setbacks or the parking sizes.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd love to know how the parking piece is going, but I'm sure we'll hear from our planners, because we did that in response to some of the parking challenges and the inability to add more parking space in some of these downtown spaces. So, but parking is a crisis in many of our downtowns also. So
I don't know which committee members or other witnesses are with us, because I don't have it on my screen.
We have everybody.
Okay, so if anybody has a question or wants to say anything, just please speak up, because I can't see anybody and I don't know that you're wanting to ask a question. Okay, so Senator Clarkson, could you tell us who our next
Our next is our AARP whiz, Kelly Stoddard-Poor, who is up next. And it's good to see you, Kelly. I haven't seen you this year. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too, Senator Clarkson. And good morning, senators. I just want to do a quick, make sure my audio is okay. I'm not coming in and out.
It's fine.
Okay, great. I had some issues yesterday afternoon, so I'm glad that is solved. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to be here to talk a little bit about accessory dwelling units and AARP's work on ADUs. I am the Associate State Director for AARP. I lead our livable community work, so really focused on how we can support Vermont communities to be able to be places that are truly livable and walkable and allow for older adults to be able to successfully age in place. So we feel that ADUs are an important component to diversifying our housing mix and can be able to provide extra and additional housing options without that overhead that a large development projects really require, those large plots of land. So the beauty about ADUs is that they can really blend into the character of a neighborhood. They can be in the backyard, they can be a garage conversion, they can be an add-on or a carve out within a home. And so a lot of times you don't even know that the ADU is there, but it can help. It can be in those lower density neighborhoods and really being able to add housing to the mix is terrific. So
Welcome
another
to macOS. VoiceOver is
another-
on application. VoiceOver off.
Sorry,
Sorry, I think we
Okay.
need people muted while
Yep,
Kelly's
that,
speaking.
that was my fault. Thank
Oh,
you.
okay.
That's all right. No problem. And ADUs provide some flexibility for homeowners as well. And so just to share a couple of important preferences among older adults is that the large majority of older adults want to be able to age in place. So survey after survey that AARP conducts both nationally and here in Vermont, we find that about 3/4 of those over the age of 50 want to be able to stay in their home. They want to stay in their community as long as possible. And I don't think that comes to any surprise to any of you, as we have built up a tremendous amount of social and economic capital in our community and in our home. But the reality is when we look around in our communities, a lot of our communities have not necessarily been designed to facilitate the independence of older adults to be able to age in place, right? I'll leave the transportation and mobility piece off to the side because I could talk about that forever. But from a housing perspective, we have a really old housing stock in Vermont, right? So 1 in 4 homes was built before 1940. So that means that the majority of our housing is built for able-bodied 35-year-olds. Narrow hallways, narrow doorways, different step entrances. And so it makes it really difficult as your mobility needs change as you age to be able to age in your home. And so that's an important piece. And a couple of other factors that I think that also make ADUs really appealing. So first, I'll share a couple of data points. Our last survey that we conducted in Vermont, which was in 2019, it was the fall of 2019, surveying those 45 and older in Vermont. We saw a large support for among 45 plus for local ordinances to support ADUs. 82% of those surveyed supported adjusting local ordinances to make it easier to build ADUs. The other question we asked in our survey was, would you consider building an ADU? And 44% said yes, and 53% said no. So that's a tremendous amount of people who are interested in building an ADU. So I think a couple of those factors that are leading to that preference is obviously our older housing stock. Also, what is another piece that's really important is that our household size is shrinking. So single person households exceed our nuclear family households. We still sort of sometimes have this conception that our households look like 2 parents and 2 children, and that's just not the case. About 30% of our households are single person households. And it's estimated by 2030 that across the United States, 75 to 85% of our households will be without children. Yet we're still building single family homes. And so our needs for housing have changed dramatically. Our household sizes are shrinking, but our houses are just as big. And so there's this like mismatch between what our housing stock is what's out there and what people really need. And so I think that really is a factor around, boosting that demand for a smaller home in more compact neighborhoods where you could be able to walk to places. And so one of the good things about ADUs, in addition, is the flexibility that they provide the homeowner, right? So there's many ways that you can use your ADU, right? So for an empty nester, right, that they perhaps could turn their ADU into long-term rental to provide additional income to help them be able to retire safely. A family with younger children could perhaps bring in a caregiver into the ADU. And for those older adults who want to be able to age in place and need additional care, they could bring a caregiver into the ADU, or they could downsize and go into the ADU, and their adult children could move into the main home. There's lots of different ways that you could work out the ADU. And for those who are working from home, perhaps the ADU can be your new home base from working remotely as well. So lots of different configurations that you can use the ADU. And this committee has done a tremendous job of addressing some of the barriers that prevent people from building ADUs. And so in the last couple of years, we've been working with the city of Burlington to address some of those barriers that prevent people from building ADUs. So we started working with the city of Burlington and our partners over at HomeShare Vermont back in it was late 2018, 2019, to address some of the barriers that prevent people from building ADUs in Burlington after we're hearing from a number of our members who wanted to build them. And so, increasing the size of the ADU was really important, eliminating the parking requirement because it was very burdensome and would really limit the number of ADUs that could be built. Streamlining that permitting process, so removing the conditional use and allowing ADUs by right in Burlington. So avoiding the DRB process, which can be very timely and costly for homeowners, allowing ADUs in all zoning districts, and allowing for lot coverage exemption when stormwater is mitigated. So those were a couple of the ordinance changes that happened so that passed in February of 2020 in Burlington. And then this committee worked on also addressing some of the barriers, and which passed that legislative year as well. And so since the passage of that local ordinance in Burlington, we've been working with the city and with HomeShare to do a number of outreach and educational opportunities for homeowners. Obviously the pandemic hit, so it sort of shifted traditional outreach efforts. And so we went to, providing a number of series of webinars for homeowners. We also put together a comprehensive guide for building an ADU in Burlington for homeowners as well, and have distributed that. Providing the webinars, and you'll hear from my colleague Eli Spivak, who he would also join us for those webinars as well. And Eli will be great, just a side note, to talk also about owner occupancy, because I know that was a point of discussion earlier. He's got a lot of great information there. And so working with homeowners, and I did send, sorry, I sent it over pretty early this morning, so I'm not sure if you had a chance to look at it, but we've featured 3 case studies that we've done in Burlington of 3 homeowners that have built ADUs in Burlington. And I just want to showcase them.
I just want you to know that Scott has already got it up on our website. So for people we have 3 case studies that you have sent us, and they're already up on our website.
Wonderful. Well, there's some great imagery there too, as well. But I just want to share really briefly those 3 case studies. So Amy turned her guest house into an ADU. It was a carriage house in her backyard. And she, after separating with her partner, felt that her house was just too big for her to stay in. And so she took out a home equity loan and transformed her carriage house into an ADU. She did a lot of the design work herself, so she was able to keep the budget down. It cost her about $50,000, and ultimately was 420 square feet for her garage conversion. And then the pandemic hit, and one of her longtime friends in Baltimore wanted to leave the city, and she moved into Amy's main, the primary house, providing rental income for Amy. And so it really provides this wonderful opportunity for her. And I'll just read a quick quote if you don't mind. "It's great as a single female to be able to knock on the back door and say, 'Hey, I'm out of sugar.' The 2 of us are not related, but there's this beauty of we have each other's backs. It's nice for me, even now as a 49-year-old single lady, but I can see it would be especially nice as I'm aging, knowing that someone is nearby." The other ADU that I want to feature is in the south end of Burlington. Ruby and Andy, who some of you might know because they're avid gardeners in the community. And they were really focused on being able to age in place. And that was a key piece to the designing of their ADU. So their ADU is in the backyard of their daughter and their son-in-law's main house. And they use their retirement savings to build the ADU, and they help with the raising of their granddaughter. And quick quote from them is, "We invested our retirement funds to build this so we'd have an affordable place to live. It's not our plan to move into a retirement home. We are planning to die here. So we built this with that in mind to avoid having to go somewhere else to finish our lives." And then the last ADU story is Brooks and Brian's in-law suite. So they did a carve out in addition to their house. And theirs was the most expensive at $140,000, and that was 600 square feet. Sorry, and Ruby and Andy's was 400 square feet, and it cost them about $75,000. And so this was a couple who moved their in into the ADU. It was towards the end of her life, and they really wanted her to be able to maintain her independence, but also the beauty of the ADU is that you have your family close by for when you need it. And a quote that I'll share about from them, she and Brooks would have coffee, watch the morning news, make breakfast, and many days part ways until early evening. Brooks's mom would fill her day walking the dog, reading, playing bridge, and going out with friends. She'd have dinner with us 4 to 5 nights a week, but otherwise was living independently about 85% of the time. You can see the flexibility that ADUs can provide to homeowners, and the beauty of being able to really to be able to age in place for many of these folks. One thing that has come out of all of these case studies and what we continue to hear from homeowners in Burlington is the complexity of building an ADU, right? So ADUs are different than any other housing development type because the majority of ADUs are built by homeowners. They're not developers. And it is by far the most significant home improvement project that many homeowners will undertake in their house. It can range between $50,000 to $150,000 to build an ADU. So the two sort of biggest barriers that remain for folks that we hear about is one is the complexity of navigating the project management of an ADU, the permitting process, the timeline, and then on top of that, the financing, figuring out how to pay for the ADU. So those are the two areas that we see a lot of opportunity to make investments, is to provide some incentives, support for homeowners to build ADUs. And then the other piece is really providing some capacity for towns to be able to help navigate homeowners through this really complex process. That's it for me.
Well, thanks. That was great.
So for other witnesses and maybe for you, Kelly, I want to go back to a very basic question that I don't know why I'm struggling with it, but that Senator Clarkson, I think, was asking, and Senator Hinsdale, other than if you had a zone in a town that only allowed for single family dwellings, if the zone allowed for duplexes, would we need ADU laws, or could you just divide your house in half or a quarter in a thing that's allowing for duplexes? What's the difference between a duplex and an ADU?
The way that the ADU, and maybe I'm not the best person to answer this, maybe Chris will be better at responding to this, but the ADU right now from both the state statute and local ordinances that I know of in Vermont is that the ADU is really tied to belonging to a single family home, right? So you can't build an ADU if you have a duplex. I think it's I don't know if the question is.
Okay, I guess my question is, if a zone in town allows for duplexes and you have a single family home there, could you simply divide? I don't know, I guess I'm just asking, is ADUs, maybe you just said this, is ADUs essentially to try and get at building more housing in zones where previously they just allowed for single family development?
Right. Yes, I agree with that. Yeah, I think that ADUs are an opportunity to add to the housing stock, to add additional housing to single family zone districts. And the beauty of it is that they blend in. A lot of times you don't even know they're in a neighborhood. I see Jacob came off of, is on here too, and he might have a better response than me.
Okay, well, we'll get there. I really appreciate that. I hope you'll support us and stay with us through this process. I know you have access to national people as well, and I think this is a very fertile area.
May I just say, Mr. Chair, Kelly, thank you for these 3 examples, because they're really so different, and they're right here. So it's great to see them, and I'm just appreciating you bringing a picture's worth 1,000 words.
It is. They tell a different part of the story.
Yeah, thanks.
Mr. Chair, I have one question for Kelly, if I could.
Sure.
Those costs, Kelly, were they pre-pandemic?
They were pre-pandemic.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So obviously construction costs are much higher now.
But I mean, hopefully not forever.
I actually had a question on the cost as well, and I was going to use my own house as an example. I have like a 1,000, well, let's say a 900 square foot basement that is has a full bath, has a full bedroom, and a nice living area. I don't know what I would have to do. Its entryway is through a bulkhead, a secure bulkhead, but and a full door. But I don't know what I would have to do additionally in terms of construction costs to turn that into an ADU. I mean, I may need to put some kitchen facilities, and I don't know if we could somehow deal with that in a law, but it's definitely a totally segregated, separate space right now that I don't know if I could rent that out. I mean, I don't think I could sell it, but right now, what the city of South Burlington would require of me, but it certainly doesn't seem to need $50,000 worth of work. And I'm sure there are plenty of houses that are set up that way where you can just put a barrier of a wall and maybe put some kitchen supplies in if that's a requirement, and you're off you go. So I know I'm being somewhat Pollyannish, but I do think there's probably a fair amount of housing stock that could be developed into ADUs that don't require all that much capital investment.
Right. And people would obviously work with somebody who could. I think that goes to Kelly's point about the capacity for planning and thinking it out, and
Right.
and working with connecting people with an architect to go through what the possibilities, because every house is different. And
Right.
I think you live in a slightly newer house than I live in. And my house was only moved to this site in 1890 as opposed to when it was built. And and I think you live in a newer, so for my house, it would be incredibly expensive to do I could see these costs being pretty high to do an ADU, but I think that's why capacity building for help, so that owners can know and this is where our regional planners could help us, because I'm sure we could make it regionally available as opposed to necessarily somebody per town, but it would be.
Probably a good segue. Is Chris Cochran our next witness?
Next witness is, I'm just sorry, I was looking at, next witness is Katie Gallagher, but we could, if Katie was willing, go to Chris and Jacob. Jacob was before Chris, but we've got Katie next.
Let me thank Kelly again. Thank you again. Yeah. And Chris, yeah, why don't you just as a segue, because I know we did put in with the bylaw modernization money, like
Right.
$150,000.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was targeted specifically for ADU technical assistance, but if you could talk about that and this subject in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can answer your question really briefly. Yes, you did put $150,000 in the budget to provide training and technical assistance for missing middle and ADU development. We have been speaking with different training organizations and working on a curricula to kind of really showcase what the opportunities are, to kind of really elevate this as an option. But I think to the point where we are now, the issue that we're trying to struggle is what the issue that we're struggling with is what Kelly just mentioned is how do we provide the capacity, that one-off, I'm going to help you through this process. If it's not simple, the owners won't do it. And then the other issue is financing. So we're working on those pieces. We do want to, we do plan to launch this training probably in the second quarter, but we want to have it all set up so we get people excited about it, and then they have the tools and assistance to kind of carry them through the process. So that's a little update on kind of where we are there. We are working closely with AARP and our partners. AARP generously offered to help us, co-sponsor this event, has offered funding. So we're very excited about it. It is truly our passion project. We want to figure out how we can help more communities, kind of empower them to take these things on. But honestly, we just got a lot on our plate, and it's been a struggle to kind of get time and space to pay attention to that. So that's the addition I would add there. I don't know if you wanted me to speak more generally about other things as well. I think it may make more sense to, given that, to hear from people who've actually done this. Katie Gallagher ran the program in the Mataru Valley, and then Tyler ran.
No, so Katie was on deck next.
Yeah.
If you're okay with that, Mr. Chair.
Okay, let's go to Katie, and then maybe we'll come back to you, Chris. I mean, my thinking is, I think where we have to, when we make some decisions about how much resources we would want to put into renovation and new housing development, there's now hundreds of millions of dollars going out there. Do we want to put more into ADU development, or are they a significant tool in our toolbox that we should say, okay, we should put, out of the hundreds of millions of dollars we're spending on addressing the housing problem, can we find within those hundreds of $1 million, $1 million to help do some turnkey ADU development, or maybe more if people need financial incentives to do that? That's our challenge in this omnibus housing bill. And, it sounds like you share the passion, Chris, but you don't necessarily, $150,000 is not going to go very far.
Yeah. $150,000 is a good marketing and education campaign. More would be needed to really kind of hit the ball out of the park.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to Katie. Thank you, Katie, for being with us. And maybe we'll come back to Chris.
Well, good morning, Senators, and thank you so much for having me here this morning. My name is Katie Gallagher, and I am the relatively new Sustainable Communities Program Director with BNRC. But prior to this role, I was a planner with the Mataru Valley Planning District, where I worked very closely with the Mataru Valley Housing Coalition. So I'm going to be speaking today from my experience there as they set up an ADU program for homeowners starting in 2020. And so the Housing Coalition in the Mataru Valley serves 5 towns. It's a nonprofit. It's not a municipal housing commission. They've had some really great initiatives since they were founded in the late 80s, actually, and they've been involved in the ADU conversation since 2009 when they created a guidebook. But in 2020, they were able for the first time to fund their first staff position. I was a part-time coordinator. Her name was Keziah Haviland, background in affordable housing development. So she brought a really incredible set of skills and knowledge to the community and to the coalition. She's actually now working with Downstreet. So unfortunately, they lost her, but we still have her in our mix, fortunately. And I just want to step back a second to somewhat address the question of where to prioritize funds. And for the Housing Coalition, part of the thinking of starting this ADU program was that it was, it's one tool in their toolbox as they were looking to address short and long-term solutions. The ADU program was a relatively simple program that they were able to get off the ground in 1 year. And in the first year, they were able to create 3 new units. So for a relatively small community, that's a pretty good start, I would say. And there was definitely pushback and folks who were saying that this wasn't a big enough solution to address our housing crisis. But I think that it's one way that we can move forward and clearly has already made a difference. So Keziah, as she was, and I won't really just want to give her credit for getting this program off the ground, but as she was going through the process to help the coalition determine how to structure the program, she reached out to several of the people on this call that you're going to hear from today. So we're in good company, but Kelly, Tyler, Eli all provided really incredible and invaluable expertise and insight. And so they really helped to craft the program ultimately. But so we learned from different models. We looked at different models in the state, different models across the country, and ultimately came down to 2 pretty key takeaways that Kelly actually just hit on. The first being that people need money. We know that ADUs are not necessarily a cheap solution, and they really need direction and help to guide them through this process. So that was the kind of underlying basis for what they were trying to achieve. And affordable housing, developing affordable rental units through the ADU program was the kind of ultimate end goal. So the structure of the program was set up so that they were able to provide kind of wraparound support services, and they would provide a grant of up to $10,000 for these homeowners in exchange for renting that unit affordably for 5 years. That would be up to 80% of area median income for studio rentals, and I think it was up to 100% AMI for 1 to 2 bedrooms. And they did actually still offer those services and guidance for folks who are interested in developing an ADU, but they weren't interested in renting the unit affordably. So those folks could still get that expertise, but not the rental, the grant funding. So the basic process that would happen for the organization, somebody would send in an inquiry. The coalition would then send them kind of a bulleted 1-pager of information. If they were still interested, they would set up a site visit where the coalition had this set team of folks that would go to the home site, describe how the program worked in more detail, the services that were provided, the responsibilities of the homeowners. They would try to confirm septic, ideally ahead of time, but if that was impossible, then once they were on the site, go through all of the things that are necessary to figure out what needed to happen in order to bring an ADU online. And I want to take a minute here to talk about the uniqueness of the Mataru Valley. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the area, but it's world renowned for its design build community. And so the Mataru Valley Housing Coalition is very blessed to have a strong community and volunteer network of folks who have lots of skills and decades of knowledge in building and construction and architecture. And so the Housing Coalition was already kind of made up of this group of folks who had all of this expertise. And Keziah, as a housing coordinator, also is a trained architect, and specifically in affordable housing development. So there was a lot of, again, skills and experience that were already within that group, so that they were able to, when they did these home site visits, be able to provide more of that building knowledge and design knowledge, and not do the design itself, but be able to at least provide some feedback and get the wheels turning for folks. And so they would, in fact, provide a rough schematic plan for the homeowners, which they could then use as more of like a visual aid when they then went to an architect or a builder in order to get a more concrete idea of what the cost would be. And so if the homeowner at that point wanted to continue to move forward, they were okay with the cost, the coalition would then pay out the grant funding and 3 installations up to that $10,000 amount. So in the first year of the program, which was, they started in 2020, by the end of the year, they had about 20 inquiries. So this is from, they represent 5 towns. So this is a still pretty small population. 3 ended up moving forward to completion. Some of them didn't make it past the first stage. That was usually due to a lack of septic capacity. Some got to the design stage, but realized that the cost was too high or something that they didn't want to move forward with. And so again, ultimately 3 moved forward. And in the second year, 2021, another 20 people expressed interest. They had went pretty far with conversations with several folks. 3 projects got very close to breaking ground, but never did. And that was because in 2021, the lack of available contractors became a huge issue. And the amount of money that was being offered, that $10,000 grant, no longer had the same weight that it did even the year previous. And so things being as difficult as they were, not a lot of people available to do the actual work, and homeowners being a little extra strapped for cash, they were no longer able to get any of those projects actually off the ground. And some homeowners had, the Housing Coalition discussed with them the potential to use and look at other sources of funding in order to combine those grants. So looking at VHIP, for example. None of them ended up pursuing that avenue. I'm not quite sure why, but that was something that was discussed as an option for people. And I also wanted to say that we chose purposefully to try and reduce the number of constraints and remove as many barriers as possible for homeowners to engage with the program. And this was really based on the advice of many of the folks on this call, but in particular, we stayed away from any federal money. And that was in an effort to have fewer constraints, to reduce the potentially onerous applications that homeowners would have to go through, and so on. And so all of our funding was able to come from the local community fund, which again was a really huge benefit for us, that we were able to have a consistent and solid source of community-based funding for those efforts. But again, in the second year, the funding that was available didn't end up being enough. So I want to touch on just 2 big challenges that were faced, and then some of the recommendations coming from the Housing Coalition. The first was that septic was the biggest obstacle that was faced. It was the issue that caused the most immediate deal breakers. And I'll touch on this a little bit more in a second, but that might not be the biggest issue for every community, but given that the Mataru Valley is a relatively rural place, and most of the homeowners who are looking to build ADUs are looking on single family lots and are going to have septic, that was the biggest issue in this area. One idea that the coalition had, but has yet to come to fruition was the potential to find a septic engineer who could offer a discounted price for their work or something along those lines. But again, that has yet to happen. Another concern was that homeowners are really worried and didn't want to have to deal with evictions or some of those, messier parts of being a landlord. And the Housing Coalition, for their part, didn't have the capacity and didn't want to be a management company. So one idea that the coalition had in that regard was to use some of the grant funding to pay for a membership for the homeowner to the Landlord Association of Vermont to help with some of those needed resources. So that's another idea there, to think about that kind of after the ADU is built, how that homeowner then has to deal with potential sticky situations. A couple recommendations specific to this program. The first, again, is just to raise the amount of the grant funding. So Keziah felt that it might be worthwhile to raise the grant amount to $20,000, so doubling it. And that might be splitting the amount to, if you want to continue to focus on the affordability component, setting aside $10,000 for that affordability, especially when we think about potentially incentivizing people to move if this is an existing unit and it's a short-term rental, for example, they could move, and we can help to incentivize them to move that short-term rental to a longer-term rental unit by using that money and that way. And then, another $5,000 to $10,000 for construction costs, or something like that. The coalition really struggled with marketing and communications, which I think is, a struggle that we all have, but especially in this case, this is a volunteer group of primarily older folks. Again, this was their first staff person and she was only on part-time. And so just getting the message out to people that this program existed was something that they could have used assistance with. They also talked about potentially creating more flexibility within the program. So ADUs as a specific type of housing unit is fantastic, but they got several inquiries from folks who were interested in slightly different types of accommodations. So for example, one elderly couple was interested in splitting their house to create a duplex so that they could sell half of their house because they wanted to remain in their home, but not be a landlord. So that was one option that they were thinking about. They also were looking at the potential for smaller grants for more of a home sharing type of situation. So you don't need to create an entirely new unit, but maybe section off the hallway or something like that to create more privacy in order to move forward with a home sharing setup. So overall, they found that it was really important and really helpful for the folks who were able to move forward or get close to building to provide those resources and hand-holding upfront to be able to tell them what the next action steps were, things like how to pull information on septic capacity, how to look for good engineers and get recommendations for builders. Going through permitting, the coalition also offered examples of leases, ads for renters, for housing rules. And again, they had a really fantastic group of builders and architects to help with that design work up front. But as I mentioned before, they recognize that there's different issues. So our biggest issue is septic, whereas in other areas, permitting might be more of a challenge than it was in the Mataru Valley, where we had very accessible and supportive planning and zoning administrators who we had been able to work with in part through this membership or membership coordination between the planning district and the housing coalition and the towns. So we were able to all kind of move forward together, and permitting was less of a challenge in that way. So I think I'll leave it there. I have a couple other thoughts and I have an ADU myself, so I have some personal experience there, but I thank you again for your time and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Katie. On the septic situation, are there possibilities with ADUs where the existing septic is clearly sufficient, or do you still have to go in for permitting whenever you do any kind of division like that? So maybe not in the Mad River Valley, but it seems like in other areas, you may have a larger home that accommodated a large family. Now the kids are all out and you want to rent to another couple. The number of people who are using the septic system is the same. What is the septic issue in that case?
My understanding is that if you, and I'm sure there's somebody else on here who will have a more concise answer than I do, but if you, you could theoretically build a 1-bedroom ADU and take one of your existing bedrooms and it's now an office, in which case you have the same number of bedrooms in that home and wouldn't have to and don't have an issue with septic capacity. But if you were to add on, you keep the same number of bedrooms, even if your kids are grown and out of the house and aren't actually living there anymore. But technically that home still has the same number of bedrooms and you've also added on another bedroom, then you will need to address the capacity issue.
Okay, thank you.
Chris.
Sorry.
So
Chris has a question, if you can see him, and then I think we're overdue for a break, and if you want to just build that into the next few minutes.
okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to affirm that Katie's explanation was correct. In our instance, we were able to transfer bedrooms to, the building across the street from us, but there's a prohibition on us for creating any kitchen facility. So I think maybe further conversations with A&R about, what's allowed and why that is the way it is, maybe merits additional conversation. So
Yeah.
Reminding me, I thought about the break. So I don't have a time here, but why don't we take a 10-minute break? I'm going to have to move along if we're going to have time for Tom Cavett this morning. So what time is it?
It is now 10:15 on the dot, and I think, and Eli, I also want to make, because isn't Eli the one from Oregon?
Yes.
So I want to make sure that we hear him before we lose him.
Okay. Yep, absolutely. Okay, let's come back at 10:25 sharp.
Thank you, Katie, and welcome. It's good to have you.